Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to this Logic Pro 10 video tutorial on understanding compression and also using the updated compressor plugin in Logic Pro 10.1 and higher. So, as you can guess, the reason why I'm doing this video is a while back I did a few videos on mixing and compression, and I used the old compressor plugin, and a lot of people have been asking me, hey, my compressor doesn't look like yours. Mine looks like it's got more whistles and bells. It's a lot more colorful. And that's because in Logic 10.1, they updated the look of the compressor plugin, and it's really nice, but the funny thing is it's actually mostly functionally the same. So what I'm going to do in this video is explain compression, give you a full tutorial of the compressor plugin, explain what everything does, and then I have a session that you can download and purchase if you want to work along with me, and I'll give you different examples of how I would compress various instruments. So this includes drums, full drum kit, bass, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and vocals. So we'll get into that as well. So let's start with just the basics. What is compression? Well, compression is a form of dynamic processing, which means that it affects the volume of a signal in some way. More specifically, compressors can affect the volume of a signal differently at different points in time. So for example, if you want to create more punchy transients, like on a kick drum or a snare drum like this, and have the tail end duck down a bit so it's a little more poppy and pokes out in the mix. Or maybe you want to pull the transient down and make the sound a little bit more woofy or boomy sounding, something like bass guitar, that doesn't really need to be super transient heavy. So again, we're affecting the volume of the signal across time by attenuating it, by compressing it down, and other points maybe pulling it back up with makeup gain. So just two examples of things you can do with the compressor. For example, on drums, you can push down the volume of a waveform, but let the transient material ring through. So maybe you want to push down your floor tom so it doesn't ring out so much and it's not as loud in the mix, but just the pop, just where the stick hits the drum, you want to pull that out. You can pull the transient out. A second example, like something like vocals. With vocals, you can level out the dynamics of the vocals across time without pushing up transients too much to make louder and softer words more even in the mix. And so we'll actually encounter both of these examples in just a moment after we get through the tutorial portion. Some of the confusion about compressors, like even just the term compressor, a lot of people say, okay, it's called a compressor, but often compression results in a louder, fuller signal. How does that happen? Well, compression does inherently push down the volume. It's a downward compression. There are upward compressors too, which are called expanders. But the compression that you apply to the signal can be boosted back up, meaning that you can squash the signal down, flatten the signal dynamically, and then add output gain or makeup gain to the compressed signal. So you can add upward gain, and we'll talk about makeup gain as well. So the first thing we need to do is we need to set this compressor plugin to a default setting where no compression is being applied. So in order to do this, we're just going to use the Platinum Digital circuit for now. We'll go over these other circuits later. Pull the threshold right here all the way up, the ratio all the way down, the makeup gain option, click on it to set it to 0. Make sure that the auto gain is on off. The knee I'm going to set to about halfway, the attack I'll set to halfway, and the release I'll set to halfway for now. And make sure the auto release is off. Make sure that the input and output gain are both set at 0. Make sure that your limiter is off. Make sure that your distortion is set to off. And make sure that your mix is set all the way to the right to output. So what we've got here in the middle is two different ways to sort of meter our gain reduction. This is a gain reduction meter. So the needle shows you how much compression you're applying to the signal at any given point in time. So it's your gain reduction meter. And there's a graph style version of it that'll give you sort of a readout of the waveform. Let's go back to meter. And as long as we have the settings in the compressor like this, we should have no compression on the signal. So what I've got here is this sort of woofy, boomy EDM kick. And I like to use kick drums to explain compression because it makes it very easy to visualize what we're doing to the signal. So I'll explain a little bit more about that in just a moment. So let me hit play here, and let's see if our needle moves at all. No, it's not moving at all because the input signal is identical to the output signal. No compression. Okay, so the two fundamental controls within any compressor are the threshold and the threshold and the ratio. The ratio is essentially how much reduction you are applying to the input signal. Or it's a factor of how much reduction you're applying. So 2 to 1, 4 to 1, 12 to 1, 100 to 1, whatever. Higher ratios result in more compression. Lower ratios result in less compression. But the ratio knob doesn't do anything without the threshold knob. The threshold essentially sets a signal that basically determines when compression takes place. So when the threshold is all the way up at 0, basically the signal cannot pass 0 dB, otherwise it'd be clipping. As you pull this down, this allows the signal to pass the threshold, and then the signal can be compressed at a factor determined by the ratio. So only signals that pass the threshold are actually compressed. So in our example, the entire kick is not being compressed, just the parts of the waveform that pass over the threshold. So let me just pull this down all the way up and pull this all the way down, and watch what happens. I'm going to hit play, and I'm just going to pull the threshold down and pull the ratio up, and you'll start to see the needle move, and you'll start to see gain reduction happening. And you can see if I use like extreme values, the signal really gets ducked down and compressed. You still hear a little bit of that click, a little bit of that attack in the kick drum. That has to do with the attack and to another extent the release parameters, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Let's take a look at this in the graph view real quick. I'll do the exact same thing. So the little white line is essentially showing you how much gain reduction is taking place as a graph as opposed to a needle. I still like to look at the classic needle view just because that's how pretty much all hardware compressors work. You see a gain reduction needle. Now, one of the goals between the ratio and the threshold is to compress the signal enough to tighten up the dynamics, but don't squash it too much. I mean, there's certain instruments where you may want to squash it a lot, but I generally try to be more conservative with compression. Maybe no more than negative 10 dB of compression, which is actually a lot. A lot of times I aim for more around like 5 or less. Okay, so we've compressed our signal a little bit. One thing I just want to do, just to give you an example and show you what this actually does to the signal, is I'm going to set my compression on our kick drum here, which has got a nice little woofy tail to it. I'm going to right click on this. I'm going to say bounce in place, or hit Control B, just so we can see how this actually affects the waveform. So you can see that with our compression rendered in, the tail has been ducked down quite a bit, but the transient's still coming through. And we'll talk more about preserving that transient better later, but it's a pretty stark difference to what we had before. We've got this big woofy tail on it. All right, so let's go back to what we had before. I'm just going to unmute this, Control M, open up the compressor again. Let's talk about makeup gain, this knob right here. The makeup gain allows you to take a signal that has been compressed down, and it allows you to apply additional gain to it. So this is one of the things I had talked about in the introduction, is that compressed signals, just using the ratio and the threshold, tend to be much quieter than the original signal. So in order to bring that back out and make the instrument pop out in the mix, you need to make it a little bit louder. So that's what the makeup gain does. It adds additional gain to the signal after the instrument has been compressed. So if we're using kind of heavier compression like we're doing here, if you look at the input and output meters, you'll see that the input is a bit louder than the output. You can see that it shows you we've got about, well, before we had about 3 to 4 dB of headroom on input, and we had about 7 dB of headroom on output. So what we can do is we can add back 3 or 4 dB of makeup gain to sort of normalize the signal and bring the kick back to its original volume again. Or add even more to hit it harder. So now when we go back and we bounce this in place again, you'll see that the signal is more normalized to what the original kick drum was like. We've just shaped the volume of it across time, but the actual hit, the actual attack is actually a little bit louder, but it's roughly the same. So we've got a signal that's maybe a little less woofy because we've applied compression to it, but still's got that nice knock to it, that nice hit to it. All right, next let's talk about the attack time parameter. Attack can be a little confusing because a lot of people confuse it as well as release with attack and release amount, but it actually has to do with attack time, sort of like an envelope in a synthesizer. Basically, its values are displayed in milliseconds, and what the attack time does is it's a length of time that the compressor lets its front-end transients bypass the compression. So essentially, the full effect of the compression doesn't take effect until after the attack time. So for our kick example, this allows us to add more punch, have a more blurred front-end transient, or make the front-end transient more poppy. So as we roll the attack time down, we're just going to get a little sliver of the kick front-end transient in there. As we roll it up, we're going to get more of like a punchy sound. And as we roll it up even further, we're going to let the full original transient through, and it'll sound more like the original kick drum. So what I'm doing is I'm just going to play this, and I'll start down like this, and I'll sort of go back and forth between high, medium, and low, and you can hear how that affects the transient material. So for a lot of instruments, you may not necessarily want this to be all the way up or all the way down. You may want it to be somewhere in between, something where you want more of like a quick pop. Like drums, you may want to try sort of like the mid range here. Something like guitar, we want a little bit more of like the natural sound to ring through. You may want to pull it up even more. And in some cases, you may pull it all the way down because you want to just completely get rid of the attack. You want the compressor to immediately take hold of the signal. So I'm going to put this somewhere between like 20 and 50 here. All right. Let's talk about the release time. So like the attack control, it has to do with time, not amount. It's a bit more confusing to understand and explain, but it's essentially how long the compressor is holding onto the compression signal. It's actually easier to understand if you just look at the gain reduction meter as I play with the release time. So if I pull this down, you'll see that the meter really reacts and jumps back to its starting value. If I use a higher time, it sort of stays down, and you get sort of a more level tail end. So you can see with the attack time or the release time up a bit, it takes a little bit longer for the gain reduction to let go, and so you see that the compression sort of stays down longer. You got to be careful with the release parameter, though, because if you pull it up too high, and it goes all the way up to 5,000 milliseconds, which is 5 seconds. So this, if it's way, way up here, this basically means that the release can actually cut into the next transient. So you don't really want to use extreme high values. It really, with the attack and release, your ear is your best guide. And I'll show you when we get to the session. I'll show you some settings that I use for different instruments that have always worked for me. There's also an auto button, which basically automatically looks ahead and adjusts the release time based on the audio material. So, and by the way, when you turn the auto on, the release time still affects the signal, but it sort of works within a variable range. All right, next let's take a look at the knee parameter. I'm just going to sort of explain it and give you a rough guideline to work with. Basically, a hard knee is considered 0, and I think we can see this in the graph. Yeah, a hard knee is considered 0, and a softer knee is up at 1. Basically, what the knee does is it determines how the signal is treated as it approaches the compression threshold. So a soft knee, the signals are, if signals are slightly over the threshold, they'll be compressed at a lower ratio than those much higher above the threshold. Softer signals, so basically this allows softer signals to be compressed less than louder signals. A hard knee treats signals slightly over the threshold pretty much the same as those much higher over the threshold. So the point to all this is that if you're trying to preserve some of your lower volumes and keep them uncompressed, you may want to go with a soft knee. If you go with a hard knee, everything over the threshold is going to be compressed equally. So typically what I do is transient heavy material that you want it to be sort of level, like drums, kick drum, snare drum. I'll make the knee really a hard knee. More organic instruments, acoustic guitar, vocals, I'll use a softer knee. All right, one last control I want to talk about in this middle section before we move over to the right section and the circuits is the auto gain function. Earlier I mentioned that you can add makeup gain to your signal as a way to take a heavily compressed signal and sort of add gain back to it so that your output signal is sort of normalized with the input signal. So right now I'm adding quite a bit of gain to normalize my output signal with my input signal. What the auto gain function does, it allows you to basically turn your makeup gain back to 0, and it allows you to automatically add gain to the signal based on one of two reference levels, so 0 dB or negative 12 dB. That doesn't mean that you are reducing your output by 12 dB. It means that your reference level is negative 12 dB. Personally, I like to set this off and just manually set the makeup gain to taste, but let me show you what this does. So with off and makeup gain at 0, my signal is very compressed. Here's 0 dB. We're clipping, and negative 12 dB. So it's just an automatic makeup gain function. All right, next let's get into the different circuit types. If I play every single circuit type for you on the kick drum, it's not really going to do us much good, but I just want to explain the difference between the circuit types, and then I'll actually dive into using some of them in our session later. But the platinum digital circuit is essentially a clean digital compressor emulation. There's no tone coloration. With all of the other circuits, these emulate different circuit types within analog compressors and apply different variables, different sounds, different levels of punchiness, and different coloration. So the ones that are labeled VCA, Studio VCA, Classic VCA, and Vintage VCA. VCA stands for voltage controlled amplifier, which is essentially a variable gain amplifier. So it attenuates or boosts the signal with the VCA. The FET ones, FET, stands for field effect transistor. FET FETs are variable resistance amps, so the FET itself can only attenuate the signal, so it can't boost the signal. There has to be another unit in line in the circuit with the FET to actually amplify the signal. And opto stands for optical. Basically, it changes, it's an optical compressor. It changes electricity to light and then back to electricity. Without getting too crazy about the electronics aspects, let's just talk about sort of the aesthetic aspects of these. I'll just sum up the differences between them. So VCA circuits tend to sound warmer. They're not as punchy. They don't react as fast. They work well with soft instruments, organic instruments, strings, pads, vocals, acoustic guitar, bass. They sort of sludge through the signal a bit more. They're a little slower. They are really great for low frequencies, especially bass guitar if you want a really deep bass guitar sound. The FET circuits are a bit more punchier. They sound quicker. There's more detail, but they're less gentle on the signal than with the VCA. So they work really well for transient heavy material, rap vocals, drums, punchier guitar playing, staccato instruments. And opto, there's only one opto circuit. It has a really fast transient response. It's very, very clean. So it's great for vocals and guitars. You can even try it out on drums. Me personally, I like using the opto, either the opto circuit or the classic VCA on vocals. I like using the vintage FET or the studio FET on drums. And I'll use like one of the VCAs usually for bass, and I'll use one of the like one of the FETs on like acoustic guitar sometimes. So it's really personal taste. You can use any of them on really any source material, but if you understand that FETs are generally more punchy, more poppy, more clear, the vintage opto is going to be the clearest, and the VCAs are going to be the slowest and the warmest. You can sort of make an educated decision just right there. All right, let's talk about a few last things before we jump into our session here. Logic's compressor is actually a compressor and limiter. So all of the circuits have a limiter that you can turn on, and everyone knows what a limiter is. It just limits the signal so you don't clip. So in case for some reason you want to intentionally clip the signal and then truncate the signal, you can do that just by turning the limiter on. So let me just use our kick drum here again as an example. I'll boost the makeup gain a bit. I'll probably pull the compression down a bit, and then I'll intentionally clip the signal, turn the limiter on, and set a threshold for the limiter so that we don't clip. And I'm also going to set my my meter over here to unity just so you can see it clipping and then not clipping. So you can see we're clipping by 1.8 dB. Let's turn the limiter on. And now we're not clipping. And you'll see the limiter light will flash and show you that the limiter is kicking in. Now, if you want your limited signal to actually be lower, you can pull the threshold down. It'll set a lower level for the limiter. So here we're at -2 dB. All right, so there's a few last things, a few last controls I want to go over just briefly. We'll more or less use them more in our actual session, more than we'll use them now, but there is a output distortion knob here that allows you to tell the compressor how to treat clipping signals. So you can apply various levels of distortion to clipping signals. So if you use the soft setting, it rounds off any clipped signals. If you use hard, it rounds them off, but in a harder way. And if you clip them, it actually squares them off. So it's basically how does the compressor handle truncating signals? Does it handle it by smoothing them over, or does it handle it by applying a hard clip to it? This will become helpful later when we start working with like a kick and snare drum and electric guitar. But for right now, this kick drum, it's not going to make too much of a difference on, so I'm going to leave it alone for now. You can also apply parallel compression. This mix knob basically is the mix between the input signal, the unprocessed or uncompressed signal, and the output or fully processed, fully compressed signal. Again, it allows us to create parallel compression or apply parallel compression, so you can actually blend your uncompressed signal with your compressed signal at a factor anywhere from 0 to 100%. So in some cases, especially with drums, this will allow us to have a little bit more balanced signal by blending the fully compressed signal with the uncompressed signal. And then lastly, you just have input gain and output gain knobs. This controls the input gain, which is the level of the signal before it goes into the compressor, and the output gain, which is the level of the signal after it comes out of the compressor. We'll also jump into the sidechain options later on, but at this point, there's no point in really covering those. All right, so I'll be right back, and we're going to jump into our session, and I'll show you some tips and tricks on how to compress various instruments within a mix. All right, so here's our multi-track session I was talking about earlier. If you'd like to work along with me or just practice mixing, you can purchase this session. It's not a full song; it's just like a one verse of a song. But you can purchase it. I'll put a link in the video description below, and I'll also include a link to it on CarneyMediaGroup.com. So let's get into it. What we've got is live drums. We've got a kick-in mic, which is like a D6. Kick out, which is like a Yamaha sub kick. Snare top was an SM7B. Snare bottom was an SM57. We have some Sennheiser clip-on mics for the top and floor tom. We had some AKG 451s for cymbal mics, and we had AKG 414s for room mics. We've got DI bass, just straight DI, no amp. We have left and right electric guitar, a little guitar lead. We have left and right acoustic guitar, and a lead vocal. So let's listen to this, and let's diagnose some of the dynamic problems, the compression problems, because and one thing I didn't mention is that every single instrument in this mix is completely unprocessed. We basically recorded everything with 0 EQ, 0 compression, 0 effects whatsoever. So this is just the straight sound coming from the mic to the preamp. The only thing that has a little bit of processing is the vocals. They've been tuned a little bit just to be in tune. And I've done a few edits here and there. But other than that, there's absolutely no EQ or compression on any of these tracks. I've also in advance sort of mixed this out just to get the levels right so nothing's clipping the master output. So let's listen to this and let's diagnose some dynamic problems.
One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day. I've worked too hard just to give up now. Your words mean nothing if you can't commit. You're walking blind, living day to day. There's no soul in your step anymore. Every day is just another waste of time. When will you scrape your soul off the system?
All right. So what I'm hearing is that the drums, particularly the close mics, so our kick, snare, and toms really need to pop out more. They need more transient heavy material. I feel like the overheads in the rooms need to be squashed a bit just to level out the cymbal crashes, level out the cymbals, level out the overall volume of the kit. The bass needs to be fattened up a bit. The guitars sound pretty good as is, and as you can see, the level is pretty dynamic, or pretty level rather. The guitar lead has a little bit more dynamics in it, so those need to be maybe leveled down. But the rhythm guitars really just need to be fattened up a little bit. We can play with the attack and release time a bit on the acoustic guitar too, just to bring out the strumming sounds a bit more. The lead vocal, as with most vocals that are recorded without any input processing, dynamically they're all over the place. You know, there's some spots that are really loud, some spots that are really soft. So let's address some of these concerns. I always like to start from the ground up when I'm mixing, so I like to start with just drums. What I'm going to do is just start with the kick in mic, just the kick in mic. What I'm going to do is just grab a little sliver of our session here. I'm going to put that on loop, and let me just solo the kick in track. And we'll pull up our compressor, and let's bypass the compressor. It's not bad. I just want to bring more out of the pop and maybe bring some of the background noise down a little bit by compressing it. So compress down, pull the attack out a little bit, and let some more of that transient ring through. Also, maybe level out those transients a bit. So we may play with the distortion and the limiter here as well. One thing I didn't mention earlier, too, is that the compressor has a whole slew of different presets. I really don't like to use the presets, but if you find that you start with the preset and then tweak it, you know, to taste, that's totally fine, too. So what I'm going to do with the kick is I'm going to pull the threshold down quite a bit. I'm going to heavily compress the kick drum. I'm going to put the knee at a hard knee. The makeup gain, I'm going to keep it 0 for now. And I'm going to listen to it and play with the attack until I get the transient sound I'm looking for. There you go. So I've compressed it pretty heavily, leaving the attack a little bit more open just so that the transient comes through. Mid-range release with the auto on. I just play with the makeup gain just to make sure that I'm sort of normalizing the signal on the right side here. Now, sometimes what I like to do with the kick drum is actually throw the limiter on there and actually intentionally clip the signal or use one of the distortion settings to get a little bit more bite out of the kick drum. Not that much though. So let's try that. And what I'm going to also do is I'm going to pull the mix down just a touch. So I'm blending the original signal with the compressed signal. I'm also going to use the studio FET setting for this, not the vintage or not the platinum digital. All right, so let's hear that with all of the drums in now. And I am going to just go ahead and pull up the actual fader as well. And really I need to add EQ in there too to get even more click out of it, but one of the limitations I'm going to put on myself for this video is no EQ, so we're going to try to make the sound as good as we can with just compression alone. All right, the kick out track, let's take a listen to that. It's way down in the mix. The kick out track is a Yamaha sub kick. It's just a really big driver, just meant to really big capsule drive or whatever. It's really like a speaker in reverse, and it's meant to pick up the sub low frequencies. So because we're dealing with lows, I may go with like the vintage VCA just to get sort of like a warmer, sludgier, slower tone. I really don't want a bunch of click off of this one. That's the kick in track. The kick out's more of like the tone, the bottom, the bass. Yeah, let's try those two together. There we go. So yeah, just a touch of compression, but 3-to-1 ratio, a lower threshold, hard knee, mid-range attack, mid-range release, turn the auto on, turn the limiter on. Cool. Let's take a look at the snare top. The snare top's really where we're going to get most of like the thwack of the snare drum. The snare bottoms, we're going to get the crispiness, the high end. So let's try one of the fets. Let's try the studio fet again. So here's the snare drum by itself, snare top by itself. Cool. Let's pull the threshold down a bit. Let's go with the 5-to-1. Let's pull the attack up a bit more. There we go. Let's pull the release up quite a bit. You'll find a snare drum if you use a really lower release, it gets kind of muddy. You pull it up, pull the attack up like mid-range, and then pull the release up a bit, sort of unmuddies it. Let's try the opto real quick. No, I like the studio fet. It's the punchiest. Let's go back to the beginning there. Yeah, another thing with snare drum you gotta be careful about is putting the attack too low. It'll really kill the thwack of the snare drum. Cool, let's take a look at the bottom snare. I don't think the transients, preserving the transients as much on the bottom snare is quite as important. Really what we want to do here is we want the sort of the crispiness to come through, but it doesn't have to be as thwacky as the top snare. So let's just pull the ratio up a bit, threshold down a bit, hard knee. Use a lower attack time, maybe a lower release too. Actually, I like a more open attack there. Yeah, let's hit this with heavier compression. Let's try the two snares together. Now let's try the kick and snare together. Cool. Let's take a look at our toms. We got a left and a right tom, an upper and lower tom. Let me just find one of these drum fills. It's pretty much the same drum fill through the whole song, so really what we need to do is just bring out the thwack and the tom. Use the studio fet again. By the way, you'll notice in some of these circuits, some of the controls are missing, like in the studio fet and studio VCA, there is no knee. In the classic VCA, you can't even control the attack or release time. So see, with the toms, when I pull the release up, you don't get as much of the ring in it. You get more of just like the thwack of when the drum, the stick hits the drum. A little more tone in there though, so we'll pull it down. If you want your toms to sound real boomy, yeah, you can pull the release all the way down. They'll be a lot more boomy. Cool. Let's copy that exact same setting over to, just holding Option over to the floor tom. And let's pull that release time up a bit more on the floor tom. I pulled the compression amount up a bit too, just to compensate for the fact that the low tom rings out quite a bit more. All right, so let's listen to the overheads now. This is just basically cymbal mics. Because we don't need a ton of punch here, I think I'm going to use one of the VCA circuits. Let me use the Studio VCA for this. I'm going to compress it pretty heavily, pull the attack down quite a bit, pull the release in the middle here. Yeah, I really want to squash this just so the cymbals are kind of even sounding. And I'll do the same thing for the rooms. Let's listen to the rooms here. All right, let's listen to all the drums together now. Just get a nice little mix. And I'll go back to the beginning and loop this whole thing. Now our output is clipping a little bit, so we need to pull these all down, keep the output from clipping. So that's with all the compression, and if we bypass all of our compression, this is without it. Now there's a lot of other things we can do this. Obviously we can add EQ, we could bus these over to an aux track, compress them as a unit as well, but just from adding compression to each channel, it's a lot fatter sounding. It was kind of thin and stale sounding before. Now it's got a little bit more meat to it. Even without any EQ, it's got a little bit more meat to it. Okay, let's move on. Let's go up the ladder here. Let's go to the bass. Kind of stale sounding, it's just DI bass. Again, normally we'd add EQ to it as well, but we're not going to do that in this video. Let's try the vintage VCA. It's a real slow acting, real slow. Actually, let's use the classic VCA. Real slow acting compressor. Let's really slam this with some compression and fatten it up quite a bit. Very simple 8:1 ratio, -30. Add some makeup gain just for volume. Let's dial that in with the drums and see what that all sounds like. Cool. Let's take a listen to our electric guitars. I'm just going to start with one of them. The guitars are panned left and right. Dynamically, they're okay. I think they're just a little thin sounding, so let's just fatten them up a little bit. For this, let me use the vintage FET. I like to use lower, for this sort of guitar, like strumming guitar, use a lower release time. Open up the attack a bit just so the transients can come through. Just a very gentle lift. Nothing nothing too drastic. Let's copy that over and listen to both of these. Cool. Gentle lift with those, nothing special. Let's check out the acoustic guitar here. So with acoustic guitar, one of the tricky things is the more you compress it, and the more you open up the attack, the more you're going to hear sort of the clickiness of the strumming. If that's the sound you're going for, like sort of like a just, you know, background acoustic guitar that's just barely there for a rhythm aspect, that's cool. If you're looking for something that's more organic, you may want to compress it less and really just compress it less, because acoustic guitar, you over compress, it starts to sound thinner and you start to lose some of the mid-range meat of the guitar. So let's see what this sounds like. Yeah, kind of like with the electric, just a little light lift. Nothing too drastic. So let's listen to everything except for the lead vocal and the guitar lead. Cool. Let's check out this guitar lead here. It's just an intro lead. It only plays for a little while. It's kind of supposed to be more in the background, but it's also got some dynamics that jump around quite a bit. So let's smooth this out. Let's try the vintage FET on this one. I'm really gonna use some heavier compression. Yeah, this one, the whole point with this one is just to kind of make the smaller, quieter parts at the end sort of the same volume as the louder stuff at the beginning. Again, just leveling it out. So here's the before. There we go. Let's see what that all sounds like with just everything except for the lead vocal. Obviously, I'd probably add some reverb or delay or something on that lead, but again, that's not part of this video. All right, finally, the lead vocal, the most troublesome part of this whole thing. And this is common with vocals. You'll get a lot of like really loud peaks and really quiet sort of crevices. So we need to go through and we basically need to choose a compressor that can really, really smooth out these vocals. For vocals, I typically use the Vintage Opto, or I'll use the classic VCA, one of these two. Let's go with the Vintage Opto, and we're really going to slam these vocals. We want them to be very dynamically level. We're going to use a soft knee. We're going to play with the attack time, and I'm going to kind of sort of set the attack time longer and set the release time sort of in the middle. I'm not going to use the wet-dry mix because I really just want it to be compressed. No distortion because I don't want any sort of over-modulating sounds going on in the vocals. So let's see what this sounds like.
One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day. I've worked too hard just to give up now. Your words mean nothing if you can't commit. You're walking blind, living day to day. There's no soul in your step anymore.
So this is like a perfect example right here. You've got this quieter section and this louder section without the compression.
You're walking blind, living day to day. There's no soul in your step anymore.
The dynamic contrast between the two sections is just, it's way off kilter. So if we turn the compressor on now.
You're walking blind, living day to day. There's no soul in your step anymore.
Sort of levels it all out. So I'm using a -30 on the threshold, a 12-to-1 ratio, about 4 or 5 dB of makeup gain, soft knee, slower attack, kind of mid-range release. Let's see what this sounds like with everything in.
One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day. I've worked too hard just to give up now. Your words mean nothing if you can't commit.
And you may still find yourself going back through and writing in automation on the vocals just to bring them out a bit more, but yeah, that sounds pretty good. So let me just play a little bit of it for you with all the compressors off, and then I'll play it with all the compressors on again, just so you can compare and contrast our before and after here.
One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day.
And now with the compressors on.
One of these days I will finally give in, but today is not that day. I've worked too hard just to give up now. Your words mean nothing if you can't commit. You're walking.
So yeah, the whole mix is a little fatter sounding. It's got a lift to it. Sounds a little bit more rounded off, a little bit more glued together. And our stereo out's still not clipping, so that's really great. All right, one last thing I want to show you guys concerning the compressor plugin is how to use sidechain compression from a practical standpoint. In a previous video, I explained how to create like a pumping sidechain compressor effect, but that was more of like a sound design synthesis effect. Here, this is something very practical. What I like to do is I like to have the bass duck out just a little bit every single time the kick drum hits, because it allows me to hear the kick drum better. By the way, if you hear a bunch of noise in the background, it's because it just decided to downpour, and so there's a bunch of rain and thunder going on in the background. Anyway, so what I'm going to do on the bass track is I'm going to add an additional compressor after my initial compression that I had there. I'm not going to do this on the same compressor plugin that we had before. And we're going to go up to the sidechain option, and we're going to choose kick in. So this means that the amplitude changes, the volume changes in the kick in track are going to affect how much gain reduction we get in the bass guitar. So watch what happens. When I'm going to hit play, I've just got the kick and the bass soloed. I'm going to pull the threshold and ratio down, and you'll see the gain reduction only hits when the kick drum hits. Now, we don't want to take this, we don't want to make this too crazy and have too much compression like this, because then you start losing the bass guitar. I just want to use a touch of it, and I want the pumping effect to be very, very quick. So I'm going to pull the attack time and the release time way down. So we're just getting the bass drum out of the bass guitar out of the way every single time the kick hits. Now you can adjust a lot of sidechain parameters from the sidechain area here, but just a few things to go over here. There's 4 buttons here: max, sum, peak, and RMS. Max and sum basically determine whether both channels, both left and right channels, are taken into consideration for the sidechain detection and compression. So with max on, only the left or the right channel has to basically exceed or go under the threshold in order to be compressed. For us, it doesn't really matter because this is all mono, but if you are using this on a stereo channel, you may want to use max instead of sum. Sum is basically takes both channels into consideration, so basically both of the channels have to go below the threshold before the sidechain compression kicks in. Very subtle difference, but it's only really going to matter when you're working with stereo material. What is a very noticeable difference is whether your sidechain detection is peak versus RMS. Peak means it senses basically the top of the waveform, the peak levels, and you'll find in peak you'll see a lot more movement usually. With RMS, that's like an average overall power is what that is. So on peak, you may actually see even some of the snare drums in the kick track compressing our bass track, and you'll see it's going to be compressed a lot heavier. So even the little snare drum in there is compressing. With RMS, it's going to take the average overall power, which is basically just the kick hits, the loud stuff, and so only the kick hits are going to actually sidechain compress the bass guitar. I prefer using RMS just because it tends to do a better, more even job, but you can play with these 4 if you're trying to do like a sidechain pumping effect like I showed in another earlier video. You may try to play around these 4 buttons and see how they affect that pumping effect. I'm not really going to go over the filter. This is just the sidechain filter. It filters the input signal. So in our case, this filters the sidechain source, which is the kick drum. So it only takes into consideration certain frequencies in the kick drum. For us, I'm gonna leave it as is. I honestly hardly ever use this, but if you really want to get dialed in, you can just make certain frequencies and your sidechain sources affect the track that you're trying to compress. All right, so that's it, guys. This has been a really long tutorial, but I had a lot of requests to, like I said, do an update video on Logic's new compressor, and so there it is. So like I've said before, if you want to follow along with what I did, you can buy this session either off of CarneyMediaGroup.com, or I'll put a link directly in the video description below. Just remember, I have my new website, CarneyMediaGroup.com. It just came out the other day. It's a great tool and a great resource to go and search for new videos and new content. Pretty much all of my YouTube videos are posted on that website, and you can search for topics. You can download videos as opposed to having to stream them. So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching.